He found the Comanche girl tied to the rails. Her next words changed his life forever. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The Arizona Territory lay in its usual quiet that late afternoon, wrapped in the kind of dusty wind that could strip the skin raw if you let it, the kind that whispered across the mesas and carried with it the dry scent of creosote and old sun-baked earth. Out here, there was nothing to stop the wind, no walls, no city streets, just wide open space and the kind of sky that seemed to go on forever. Pale blue at the edges and washed white in the center where the sun hung heavy. Somewhere in that distance, faint but growing, came the low, steady cry of a train whistle. It cut through the silence like the memory of a song, a reminder that even in the emptiest places, something was always moving. A lone rider moved through that desert, his horse's hooves kicking up soft plumes of dust with each step. His name, though no one in these parts had much cause to use it, was Caleb Mercer, a man who had been riding alone long enough for solitude to feel like an old friend. His hat sat low over his brow, shielding his eyes from the glare. The brim was worn and frayed, the leather cracked from years of sun. He rode without hurry, his frame easy in the saddle, though his gaze moved restlessly over the land ahead. It was a habit of his, scanning for trouble, for movement, for anything out of place. Out here, those who didn't keep watch didn't last long. Canyon Diablo lay a few miles ahead, a jagged split in the red rock where the rails cut across the desert. The train ran through twice a day, once westbound, once eastbound, hauling freight and the occasional car full of passengers. Caleb knew its schedule without needing to check a watch. Out here, you learned to tell time by the way the sun hit the canyon walls and by the sound of iron wheels far off in the heat shimmer. That day, something caught his attention before the train's whistle did. It was just a flicker at first, a movement near the dark line of the tracks ahead where the rails gleamed faintly in the late sun. He slowed his horse, squinting into the glare. At this distance, it could have been anything: a tumbleweed lodged against the ties, a scrap of fabric blown from a rail car, even a stray coyote nosing about for shade. But as he drew closer, the shape began to take form. It was human. Caleb's shoulders tensed, and he gave his horse a nudge. The gelding picked up speed, his steady trot shifting into a long, ground-eating lope. The wind rushed louder in Caleb's ears as the shape grew clearer with every stride. A person lying across the tracks, twisting, struggling against something unseen. When the distance closed enough for detail, his gut tightened. It was a girl, young, maybe 16 or 17. Her dark hair tangled and whipping in the wind, her wrists bound to the iron rails with thick rope. She wore a dress that had once been fine, but was now torn and dusty, streaked with the red earth of the desert. Her face was turned toward him, eyes wide, mouth working silently against the gag tied across it. The realization hit sharp and cold. Someone had left her there to die. He pulled his horse to a sliding stop, boots hitting the ground before the animal had fully stilled. The sound of the train was louder now, still distant, but no longer just a faint whisper in the desert. Caleb's eyes darted down the length of track in both directions, measuring distance, calculating time. A mile, maybe a little more. Out here, the engines moved fast when the ground was level. He dropped to his knees beside her, fingers working quickly at the knots. Whoever had tied her had known what they were doing. The ropes were tight, pulled so hard they'd left angry marks on her skin. She flinched at his touch, her eyes still wide with terror. "It's all right," he said, his voice steady but quick. "I'm gonna get you out." The words seemed to register, and she stilled just enough for him to work. But the rope was stubborn, the fibers thick and dry, refusing to give beneath his fingers. He pulled his knife from his belt and sawed through the first loop. The train whistle came again, louder now, sharper, the kind of sound that told you the engineer had spotted something ahead. The girl jerked as the last rope around her right wrist came free, but her ankles were still bound. Caleb moved down, cutting through them as the rails beneath them began to hum. The heat from the sun had made the steel hot to the touch, but now it carried another kind of warmth, the faint vibration of something massive rushing closer. He pulled her clear just as the wind shifted, carrying with it the deep rhythmic pounding of the locomotive's approach. They stumbled together into the scrub beside the track, falling hard into the dirt. A moment later, the train roared past, black engine gleaming, steam hissing from its stack, the noise so loud it swallowed the desert whole. The blast of air it left behind tore at their clothes and sent grit stinging against their skin. When it was gone, the land felt impossibly quiet again, as though the moment had been carved out of time itself. Caleb sat back on his heels, breathing hard, the knife still in his hand. The girl lay beside him, gasping for breath, her hair plastered to her damp face. Slowly, she pulled the gag from her mouth, her hands trembling. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was hoarse but clear. "I'll be your wife," she said, each word deliberate, heavy. "I'll do whatever you ask." Caleb stared at her, caught between disbelief and the echo of the train's passing. In all his years out here, he'd seen desperation, gratitude, and fear, but never had he heard an offer like that from a stranger he'd just pulled from death. The desert wind swept across them again, carrying away the last trace of the locomotive's smoke. Somewhere far ahead, the rails still gleamed in the fading light, and the sound of the train was already nothing more than a memory. The world narrowed to the length of track between him and the girl. Caleb's boots hit the dirt hard, the dry earth breaking into puffs beneath each step as he ran. Behind him, his horse stood with ears pinned forward, uneasy at the vibration in the rails. The sound of the train was no longer just a whistle on the wind. It was a living thing now, heavy and unrelenting, chewing up the miles with each turn of its iron wheels. He reached her in a breathless blur, knees hitting the ground beside her bound body. The ropes cut deep into her skin, the coarse hemp biting into her wrists and ankles like a second set of shackles. She thrashed when he touched her, fear making her movements wild, but he caught her gaze for the briefest moment. "It's all right," he said quickly, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to get you out." The knot at her wrists was pulled so tight it seemed fused into the rope itself. He dug his fingers into it, trying to work it loose, but the desert heat had dried the fibers until they were stiff as bone. His breath came harder, not from the sprint, but from the creeping awareness of how close the train was. The rails beneath them were alive now, not just humming, but thrumming with deep, steady vibrations that traveled straight up through his knees. A gust of wind pushed at them from the west, carrying with it the sharp tang of coal smoke. He knew that smell, knew how close it meant the engine was. He yanked his knife from the sheath at his hip and set to sawing at the rope. The blade was sharp, but the fibers clung stubbornly, fraying in slow, reluctant strands. Behind him, the low thunder of the train was joined by a high, urgent wail from the whistle. The engineer had seen something ahead. The girl made a muffled sound through the gag, eyes wide, urging him on with a desperation that needed no translation. He freed one wrist, then the other, shoving the cut rope aside. She reached for her ankles, but her fingers were clumsy from lack of blood flow. Caleb dropped down, slicing through the knots himself. The last one was buried under a twist of rope that refused to give, as if the man who tied it had wanted to make damn sure she wouldn't see another sunrise. The first shadow of the train stretched across the ground in front of them, dark and growing. Come on," he muttered under his breath, his hands moving faster now. A final stubborn strand gave way behind the knife, and suddenly she was free. He grabbed her by the waist and hauled her clear of the rails, stumbling backward with her weight against him. The two of them went down hard into the dirt, just as the black bulk of the locomotive thundered past.
The ground shook under its weight, and a wall of hot steam blasted over them, carrying with it soot and grit that stung their skin. The noise was deafening, a roaring mix of churning wheels, pounding pistons, and the hiss of escaping air. Caleb's hat nearly tore from his head in the gale, but he held the girl close until the last car clattered past and the noise began to fade. When the silence returned, it felt unnatural. The wind carried only the faint echo of the train's retreating rhythm, and the land around them seemed to hold its breath. Caleb eased her upright, checking her arms and legs for injury. Her skin was scraped and reddened where the ropes had bitten in, but she was breathing steady now, eyes locked on his with something between relief and disbelief. With trembling fingers, she reached up and pulled the gag from her mouth. It fell into the dirt between them, a damp and dirty scrap of cloth that might as well have been a noose. She swallowed, her lips dry and cracked.
"I'll be your wife," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "I'll do whatever you ask." For a moment, Caleb thought he'd misheard her. Maybe it was the ringing in his ears from the train's passing, or the rush of blood still pounding through him. But the words hung in the still air, unshaken, as if she had chosen each one carefully. His grip on her loosened, though he didn't step back. The wind picked up, carrying fine dust across their boots, tugging at the strands of her hair. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, as though this strange offer was as natural as asking for a drink of water. Caleb's mind scrambled for a reason, for the kind of logic that would make sense of this. Was it gratitude, a promise born out of the relief of survival? Or was it desperation, a way to tie herself to the one man who'd shown up when no one else would? In all his years riding these territories, he'd heard plenty of bargains made on the edge of death. Gold promised, land offered, debts sworn. But never this. Never from someone he'd just cut loose from certain death. He realized he was still holding her, though more gently now, his hands resting just enough to steady her on her feet. She seemed lighter somehow, though he knew it was only because the weight of the ropes was gone. "You don't have to," he began, but the words faltered. He wasn't even sure what he was telling her not to do. Her gaze softened, but her jaw stayed set. "I know," she said simply. The distant whistle sounded again, faint now, as the train disappeared toward the horizon. Caleb let the sound wash over him, grounding himself in its rhythm. The moment had been too fast, too raw, to make sense of just yet. All he knew was that the desert around them felt different now, as though some invisible line had been crossed. She took a slow step back, but not far enough to break whatever fragile thread now tied them together. Her hands hung at her sides, fingers flexing like she was testing the reality of being free. Caleb drew a long breath and adjusted the brim of his hat, though his mind was still turning over her words like a stone in his palm. Gratitude. Or desperation. He couldn't tell, and maybe, for now, it didn't matter. The ride back to his camp was quiet, the kind of quiet where words would only get lost in the wind. Caleb let her sit the saddle while he walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, the other resting on the worn leather of his gun belt. She sat straight but tense, glancing around often, as though she half expected the desert itself to reach out and pull her back toward those rails. His camp wasn't much, just a fire pit, a bedroll, and a canvas lean-to pitched against a rocky outcrop to break the wind. But it was enough. He helped her down from the horse, feeling the stiffness in her movements. She didn't stumble, but he could tell the ropes had left more than just marks on her wrists and ankles. They'd taken some of her strength, too. From his saddlebag he pulled a canteen and offered it to her. She drank greedily at first, then slower, like she remembered she had to make it last. Water in the Arizona Territory was never something you took for granted. When she lowered the canteen, a few drops clung to her lips before disappearing into the dust. "What's your name?" he asked finally, breaking the long stretch of silence. She looked at him for a moment, as if weighing whether the truth was safe with him. "Nocona," she said at last. Her voice was steadier now, though still soft from the strain. My mother's people are Comanche. My father was not. Caleb nodded once. How'd you end up tied to those rails? Her eyes went distant, and she sank down onto the bedroll as though the telling of it might take more out of her than the ride had. It was because of a man, she said slowly, a white man who came to trade with my people. He wore the face of a friend, but his hands carried lies. She paused, drawing in a long breath. The desert wind moved through the camp, lifting strands of her hair into the fading sunlight. Caleb didn't press her. Out here, some stories needed room to breathe. He called himself Vance Keller, she continued. He came with gifts, sugar, cloth, even rifles. He spoke our tongue well enough to fool the elders. Said he wanted peace between his people and ours. My uncle believed him. I wanted to. Caleb kept his gaze steady, though the name meant nothing to him, not yet. But Keller wanted more than trade. He wanted our land near the canyon, where water runs even in the dry months. When my people refused to sell, he waited until the men rode out to hunt. Then he came back with others, men with guns and hard eyes. Her fingers curled into the blanket beneath her. They took what they wanted: food, horses. My little brother tried to stop them. Her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard before finishing. They left him in the dust.
Caleb felt the old, familiar heat in his chest, the kind that came when you heard of men using power like a weapon against the defenseless. "They took me with them," she went on, "said I'd be traded to another camp, maybe to Mexico, but Keller had a different idea. He laughed when I fought him, told me if my people wouldn't give him the land, he'd make sure no one ever saw me again. Said a girl tied to the rails would send a message they'd never forget." Her voice grew flat at the memory, like the words were no longer hers, but something she had to carry until someone else heard them. "He left me there in the sun, waiting for the iron horse to come." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind moving through the mesquite and the soft creak of leather as Caleb shifted his weight. He had no trouble believing her. Men like Keller were as common out here as the dust, and twice as hard to get rid of. "You're lucky I was riding that way," he said finally. She met his eyes, something unreadable in her gaze. "Maybe it wasn't luck," she said quietly. Caleb let the words hang there, unsure what she meant. But he could see the way her shoulders had eased just slightly, the way her breathing had slowed now that her story was out in the open. Whatever thread tied them together had grown stronger in the telling, though he wasn't sure yet if that was a comfort or a burden. As the sun dipped lower, painting the canyon walls in bands of gold and red, Caleb stirred the fire to life. Nocona sat close enough to feel its warmth, her hands resting on her knees. She didn't speak again, and neither did he. But when the flames caught and the night began to settle in around them, he noticed she no longer kept glancing toward the horizon. Somewhere in that silence, an unspoken understanding passed between them, a fragile truce between two strangers, both marked by loss, bound together now by the kind of chance meeting that changes the road ahead. Caleb sat with his back against the rock wall, the firelight flickering across the lines of his face. Nocona had curled up in her bedroll, her breathing slow and steady now, exhaustion finally winning over fear. The desert night was cool, and somewhere in the distance a coyote yipped, answered by another farther off. He stared into the flames, but his mind wasn't on the fire. Arizona had a way of swallowing a man whole, and Caleb knew it better than most. He'd come here chasing the kind of dreams men told in saloons, a gold claim said to be as rich as the Sierra itself. He'd staked his patch of ground up near the Black Hills, spent months digging, sweating, bleeding under that relentless sun. In the end, the earth gave him nothing but blisters and a back bent from shoveling rock. The gold had been gone long before he arrived, stripped out by faster men with deeper pockets. All he had left was a pile of deaths and the bitter taste of hope turned sour. He could have gone back east,
But the truth was, there wasn't much to go back to. Her face came to him now, Clara, soft smile, hair the color of wheat in summer. She'd waited for him once, through long months of letters and promises. But promises break easy when they're made of paper. One winter, he got word she'd married another man, a storekeeper's son, steady income, warm home. Caleb couldn't blame her, not really, but it left a hollow place in him that never quite closed. That's how he ended up drifting to Arizona, taking odd jobs, cattle drives, rail work, sometimes guarding freight runs. Alone was easier. Alone meant no one to bury. Now here he was, with a Comanche girl sleeping by his fire, a girl whose life had just been marked by the kind of cruelty he'd seen too many times. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the grit there. Helping her wasn't as simple as pulling her off the rails and riding away. A man like Vance Keller wouldn't forget. If Keller learned she was alive, he'd come looking, and men like that didn't come alone. Then there was the railroad. Caleb had worked for them once, and he knew how they operated. Cold steel and colder hearts. A girl tied to the tracks made for bad headlines, and the company would want the matter buried quick. If they found out she was still breathing, they might try to solve the problem before it caused trouble. He thought about the next town, a day's ride west. He could leave her there, maybe find someone willing to take her in. A mission house, perhaps. She'd be safer there than trailing along behind him, with Keller's men and the desert both at her back. But the thought didn't sit right. He looked over at her. Even in sleep, there was a tension in her, like a bowstring pulled too tight.
Her hands twitched now and then, as if she were reliving the fight to free herself from those ropes. And there was something else, the way she told her story, voice steady even through the worst of it. She'd looked him in the eye the whole time. It reminded him of the miners he'd known who kept digging after cave-ins, because stopping meant admitting the mountain had beaten them. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the embers. He didn't owe her anything. Not in the strict sense. But maybe he owed himself something, the chance to stand between someone and the kind of men who'd walked over him too many times. Still, the risk was heavy. Trouble with Keller could mean a bullet in the back. Trouble with the railroad could mean no work for 100 miles in any direction. Out here, both could get a man killed faster than thirst. Caleb sighed, rubbing his jaw. In the silence, he could hear the faint, even rhythm of her breathing. He thought of Clara again, and how he'd been too far away to keep her from choosing another life. Maybe this was different. Maybe this time he could stand close enough to matter. When he finally lay down on the other side of the fire, the decision wasn't made yet. But he knew one thing. When morning came, he wouldn't point his horse toward the nearest town. Not yet. Somewhere in the night, Nocona stirred, murmuring something in her own tongue. Caleb didn't understand the words, but the tone was soft, almost trusting. He closed his eyes, letting the desert wind carry the sound away. Morning would bring answers, or trouble. Maybe both. The sun was already burning its way over the mesas when Caleb saddled his horse. Nocona stood nearby, wrapped in a blanket, watching him with that quiet, measuring gaze of hers. She hadn't said much since they'd broken camp, and he hadn't pressed her. Some wounds needed silence more than talk. They were breaking bread when the sound of hoofbeats drifted in from the east, faint but growing. Caleb rose, one hand drifting to the colt on his hip. A lone rider came into view, dust swirling behind him. The man reined up a dozen yards away, tipping his hat in greeting. "Morning," he called, voice rough from the trail. "You Caleb Ward?" Caleb didn't answer right away. "Depends who's asking." The stranger swung a leg over and dropped to the ground, his boots kicking up grit. "Name's Briggs. I was in Canyon Diablo last night. Word is Vance Keller's riled up something fierce. Claims a Comanche girl he was holding got loose, and he's paying good money to anyone brings her back." Caleb felt Nocona stiffen beside him. She didn't speak, but her hand gripped the blanket tighter. Briggs spat in the dirt. "A man like Keller don't like being embarrassed. Said he's got riders spread out all over, north, south, don't matter. He'll find her. Thought you might want to know." Caleb gave a slow nod, tossing Briggs a piece of jerky for his trouble. "Appreciate the warning." When the rider was gone, Caleb turned to Nocona. "We ride west," he said. "We put distance between us and Diablo before the sun's high." She didn't argue, just gathered her things. The land between Canyon Diablo and the western ridges was unforgiving. The trail wound through stretches of red sandstone and dry washes, dotted with cactus and stubborn mesquite. The air shimmered with heat, and their canteens grew lighter with every mile. By midday the sky turned white with heat. Caleb kept them off the main trail, skirting arroyos and cutting through patches of scrub. He scanned the ridgelines every few minutes, looking for the glint of sunlight off rifle barrels or the shadow of riders. They spoke little, but in the quiet, Nokona began to match his pace without being told. When he slowed to scan the horizon, she did too. When he swung wide around a patch of soft sand, she followed without question. Late in the afternoon, they found a narrow canyon where the rock walls offered shade. They watered the horses at a trickle of a stream, then rested until the heat bled out of the sky. Caleb sat sharpening his knife, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon mouth. That was when he saw it, a thin curl of dust far out on the flats. It moved in slow, steady lines. Riders. They found the trail, Caleb said low. Nokona's eyes narrowed, following his gaze. They moved again before the sun dipped too low, riding hard for the cover of the western buttes. The horses' hooves drummed against the hard pan, and Caleb kept glancing over his shoulder, measuring the distance. The riders weren't close enough to see their faces, but the dust plume was a constant reminder. By the time they made camp that night, both were bone-tired. Caleb built a small fire, barely big enough to warm a tin of beans. The flames painted Nokona's face in shades of gold and shadow. For a while they ate in silence. Then she spoke, her voice softer than he'd heard it yet. "You could leave me. You would be safe." Caleb met her gaze across the fire. "Safe's a matter of perspective. Keller's the kind of man who makes the world smaller for everyone. You stand up to men like that, or you spend your life looking over your shoulder." She studied him a long moment, then nodded. "My father used to say, a wolf will always test the edge of the firelight." Caleb gave a faint smile. "Your father was a wise man." When they finished eating, Nokona moved to sit beside him, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. The desert night stretched out before them, vast and endless. Out beyond the fire, the land glowed faintly under the rising moon. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking. The tension between them had shifted, not gone but softened. Caleb found himself telling her about the first time he'd ridden west, about the storm in the mountains that had nearly drowned him and the gold claim that had been nothing but rock and lies. She listened without interruption, her eyes on the horizon where the last streaks of sunlight faded to violet. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about Keller or fear or running. "This place," she said, "it can take everything from you, but sometimes it gives back." Caleb followed her gaze to where the land met the sky. The air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of sage. For the first time since Canyon Diablo, the weight on his shoulders eased just a little. They didn't need to say it, but both knew the truth. Keller's men were out there, closing in. But for this one moment, under the quiet Arizona sunset, there was something between them stronger than fear. Tomorrow the chase would begin in earnest. Tonight, they let the horizon hold them in its silence. The wind was sharp that morning, carrying the scent of rain that never seemed to come. Caleb led Nokona along a stretch of rusted tracks that cut through the land like a scar. Ahead, half buried in sand and time, sat the abandoned rail stop at Canyon Diablo, a relic from when the railroad had first tried to tame this part of Arizona, before the land had beaten them back. The station leaned against the wind, its boards warped and sun-bleached, windows punched out by years of dust storms. A water tower stood skeletal beside it, its tank long dry. Caleb's boots crunched over scattered gravel as he led the horses inside what was left of the freight shed. "This'll hold us for the night," he said, scanning the shadows for snakes or squatters. Nokona moved quietly, her eyes flicking over the place like she was memorizing every exit. They had just settled, the horses watered from a skin when Caleb froze. The sound was faint but distinct, the rhythm of hooves on hardpan. He stepped to the broken window and looked east. A line of riders emerged from the heat shimmer, moving with purpose. Even from this distance, Caleb recognized the shape of the man in front, Vance Keller. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing that battered black hat that seemed like part of his skull. "They've found us," Caleb said. Nokona's jaw tightened. "How many?" "Too many." They moved quickly, shoving crates against the doors, checking their weapons. Caleb's rifle was clean and loaded, his Colt ready at his side. Nokona picked up a double-barreled shotgun from the corner, checking the break and the shells like she'd done it 100 times before. When Keller's men reached the rail stop, they spread out in a slow, deliberate circle. Keller dismounted, stepping forward until he was close enough for Caleb to see the grin under his mustache. "Ward," Keller called, his voice carrying in the dry air. "You've got something that belongs to me." Caleb leaned against the window frame, rifle steady. "Funny, Keller, I don't see your name on her." Keller's grin widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "You hand her over, we all walk away. You keep her, well, then this place becomes your coffin." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the restless stamping of horses. Then Keller gave a sharp gesture and the first shot cracked through the air. The station erupted with noise, bullets punched through dry boards, filling the air with splinters and dust. Caleb returned fire, his shots forcing two riders to dive for cover. Nokona crouched near the doorway, the shotgun booming in short, controlled bursts that sent echoes rolling across the desert. The fight was close and ugly. Bullets ricocheted off rusted rails, glass shattered, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with the dry scent of dust and sweat. Caleb worked the rifle like it was part of his own body, each shot deliberate, measured. But Keller's men kept pressing in, using the old water tower and freight crates for cover. A round tore through Caleb's sleeve, grazing his arm, the burn sharp and hot. He gritted his teeth and kept firing. Then one of Keller's men broke for the side, aiming to flank them. Caleb started to pivot, but Nokona was faster. She stepped into the open, raised the shotgun and fired. The man spun and dropped, his rifle skittering into the sand. Caleb glanced at her, just long enough to see the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting for him. The gunfire dragged on, but finally Caleb's last shot clipped the post beside Keller, sending a spray of wood chips into his face. The outlaw cursed, signaled his men, and they began to pull back, firing as they went. Caleb exhaled slowly, watching the dust cloud fade as Keller's riders disappeared into the distance. He knew this wasn't over. Keller didn't strike him as the type to let an insult go unanswered. Then he felt it, a deep ache in his side. He looked down and saw the spreading stain on his shirt just above the hip. Somewhere in the chaos, a bullet had found him. Nokona was at his side in an instant, her hand steady as she eased him to the floor. "Stay with me," she said, her voice low but firm. Caleb tried to make light of it. "Yes. I'll be needin' that coffee we never got around to." She gave him a look, half anger, half something else, and started tearing a strip from her blanket to press against the wound. Outside, the desert had gone still again, but Caleb knew the quiet was only temporary. Keller would be back. And next time he'd bring hell with him. The shack stood alone in a dry gulch, its roof patched with rusted tin and cedar boughs. Caleb had found it years ago while tracking strays, and now it was the only place far enough from the rails and the main trails to buy them a little time. By the time they reached it, the sun was low, bleeding red across the horizon. Nokona half carried him inside, her small frame belying the strength in her arms. Caleb lowered himself onto a rough cot in the corner, the smell of old pine and dust filling the room. His side burned with each breath, but he forced a crooked smile. "You patchin' me up or burying me here?" he asked. She knelt beside him, her dark eyes steady. "You are not dying," she said simply, pulling a bundle from her satchel. Inside were strips of buckskin, a clay jar of salve and a pouch of dried herbs. The fire she'd lit in the stone hearth threw a warm light over the walls. She worked with quiet focus, washing the wound with water from her canteen, then packing it with a paste that smelled of sage and pine resin. "My grandmother taught me," she said without looking up. "She was a healer for our people. She said the earth gives what we need if we listen." Caleb watched her hands move, quick but gentle, sure in their purpose. "You've got a steady touch," he murmured. "Better than any doctor I've seen in town." She tied the dressing snug and sat back, meeting his gaze. "Doctors in your towns don't see the same things we do. They don't know how to heal the spirit." For a long moment neither spoke. Outside, the wind whispered through the gulch and the fire popped softly. "You asked me before why I didn't leave you in the desert," Caleb said finally. "Truth is, I've been riding alone for a long time. Too long. Somewhere along the trail, I forgot what it was like to have someone look at me the way you did, like I was worth trusting." Her expression softened, though she didn't drop her gaze. "You saved me from the rails. But more than that, you saw me. Not just a Comanche girl. Not just trouble. Me." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "I can get you to safety. There's a ranch west of here, good people, a place where Kell'll never find you." She shook her head slowly. "Safety is not enough, Caleb. My people have been pushed from our land, hunted like animals. Safety comes and goes. But a heart? She touched her chest lightly. A heart that's true, that is worth more than all your fences and locked doors. He felt the weight of her words settle between them. For years, his own heart had been like this shack, weathered, patched, and empty. But somewhere between Canyon Diablo and this gulch, she'd walked right in without asking, and he hadn't the strength or will to send her away. I can't promise the trail ahead will be easy, he said. But if you'll have me, you won't have to walk it alone. Her lips curved into a small smile, not the shy, uncertain kind, but one that carried both warmth and resolve. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. Then we walk it together. The firelight wrapped them in its glow, the outside world momentarily forgotten. The shack wasn't much. No paint, no comfort beyond what they made themselves. But for the first time in years, Caleb felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. Morning came with a pale gold light spilling over the rim of the gulch. The air was still, holding none of the tension that had gripped them for days. Caleb stepped outside the shack, his side still sore but his steps steady. Down in the valley, a small group of riders approached from the east, the sheriff and his deputies. When they reached the shack, the sheriff tipped his hat. "Keller won't trouble you no more," he said simply. "We caught him holed up near Flagstaff. He'll hang for what he's done." Caleb nodded, a slow breath leaving his chest. There was no triumph in the news, only the quiet finality of it. Trouble was gone, but the road ahead was still uncertain. After the deputies rode off, he began saddling his horse. The Comanche girl, Nocona, stood nearby watching in silence. The wind tugged at her braids, carrying with it the scent of juniper and dust. "I'll take you as far as the San Pedro," Caleb said, tightening the cinch. "Your people might be there. Safer for you." Her eyes followed his hands as he worked, but she didn't move. "And you?" He adjusted the stirrup leather. "I'll keep riding. Always have. Guess I don't know how to stop." There was a long pause. Then she stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. "You think I want to go back because it's safe? Safety is not why I followed you from the rails, Caleb." He froze, turning to face her. "I've known men who could fight and men who could run," she went on. "You are the first who did both to keep someone else alive. My people honor that. And I honor it too." For a heartbeat, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Caleb's fingers loosened on the reins. "Nocona, you've got your life back. You can start fresh. You don't need." She cut him off with a small shake of her head. "I don't need saving anymore. But I choose you." The words settled in his chest like a warm fire on a cold night. In all his years drifting from one horizon to the next, he'd never had anyone choose to stay. He gave a slow nod, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Then I guess this trail ain't so lonely after all." Within minutes, her bundle was tied to the back of his saddle, and she swung up onto the paint mare they'd found in the canyon. They rode side by side, the shack shrinking behind them until it was only a shadow against the land. The Arizona sky stretched wide and endless above, the kind that made a man believe the world still held places untouched by time. In the distance, faint and low, came the echo of a train whistle, not the sound of danger anymore, but of a story that had already passed into memory. They didn't speak as they rode, words felt small against the vastness ahead. The sun climbed higher, painting the land in shades of gold and red. Two riders, one trail, and the promise of whatever lay beyond the next rise. And for the first time in years, Caleb didn't wonder where he was going. He already knew.